Welcome to Cross-Border Tax Talks, where we discuss the latest trends in international taxation, from Pillar 2 to macroeconomics and geopolitics. I'm Doug McHoney, PwC's International Tax Services Global Leader. PwC's Pillar 2 engine, powered by Beacon, is a game changer for Pillar 2 modeling, provision, and compliance calculations. Built on a graph system utilizing over 20 years of international tax technology, this cloud-based centralized rules engine is developed by a team of Pillar 2 tax experts from around the globe. PwC's Pillar 2 engine is currently available as a service and is now available to license. On this week's episode of Cross-Border Tax Talks, we're back at PwC's International Tax Conference at Dana Point, California, recording in front of a live studio audience. I am thrilled to welcome back Dr. Alexis Crow to the podcast. Alexis is a partner and chief economist at PwC in the US. Prior to joining PwC, Dr. Crow taught at the London School of Economics. Alexis, welcome back to the podcast.
Pleasure to be back, Doug.
So, when I started my career over 26 years ago, international tax was not a topic in the news. You recorded your first Cross-Border Tax Talks podcast with me at our International Tax Conference in March of 2019, if you can believe that. We now see international tax regularly mentioned in the larger geopolitical and macroeconomic environment. My question is, do you attribute that to our podcasts?
Absolutely. No, I would say it's interesting, right? I mean, one of the big questions we face today is around fiscal space and what governments can do, particularly G7 governments can do while we're at record levels of government debt. Obviously, the fiscal situation was not even an election topic in the US, but other countries are facing this. So, of course, taxation and international taxation is just a natural corollary add-on to this discussion of where's the money going to come from.
Yeah, and we're not going to be talking about Pillar 2, which is one of my favorite topics, but the introduction of a truly global tax system really changed the game and the discussion. You know, it was something that was decided upon by the G20 countries, and it's been a turbulent, to say the least, 10 years, sort of as the OECD has been focusing on this. But we're not here to talk about Pillar 2. We're not here to talk about tax. We're here to talk about macroeconomics and geopolitics. The first thing that I want to mention for listeners is that every year I look forward to what you refer to as your annual Outlook 2025. This year's was called Back to the Future, published in January of 2025. I will also note for listeners that we're actually recording this on March 4th, less than 24 hours after the Trump administration imposed 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico, as well as an additional 10% tariffs on imports. I usually don't give caveats for the podcast, but things are changing so quickly. I wanted to provide some context for listeners. So what I wanted to go through today was some of the macro currents and things that you're seeing. I love, my favorite part is going through the geopolitical landscape, kind of the regions, and then finishing with the sectors. But let's start with the what you refer to in your annual outlook as market moves and macro currents, and you call it the outlook for markets, activity, inflation, and monetary policy. And you already hinted at some of the fiscal cliff issues. So why don't we start there?
Sure. I mean, thanks so much. And really, it's an honor and privilege to be with everyone here in California today. Firstly, with regard to markets, I mean, it's very clear that you mentioned things are changing so quickly, but the reason why we called the annual outlook Back to the Future is because we only need to look back at Trump 1.0 to see some of the signposts of where 2.0 we're going to go. And what was remarkable was investors and market participants were very complacent and very forgetful about the imposition of tariffs during 1.0. So we only need to use that as the guidepost. And certainly we're here today. The difference is that we're in a very different part of the cycle when it comes to the imposition and the escalation of these tariffs. So households are overstretched. Credit card delinquencies in the United States reaching a series high for the Philadelphia Fed across income brackets. You also see, as I mentioned, governments are overstretched. Companies, again, if you need to go out to capital markets, are going out at a much higher interest rate environment. So we're
very different interest rate.
Very different part of the cycle. And again, we have to ask, principally in consumer-driven economies such as the United States, how far can the consumer go? How much can retailers, for example, push on potential increases in costs to the consumer. And that's the kind of scary point where we are. So now, of course, markets have responded in kind. Magnificent Seven is down 2% since the inauguration. We're seeing the dollar tumble. We're seeing the yields on the US 10-year start to slip as well. All of this off the back of a concern about relenting growth in the US. It's also concerning from a global economic standpoint because the US has hitherto been the engine of growth for advanced economies, this kind of single engine propping up growth amidst advanced economies.
So one of the big concerns, obviously, for consumers is in inflation. And I think one of the other large concerns that you write about in your piece is with respect to the fiscal cliff. Maybe could you talk a little bit about those two particular pieces, maybe at a macro level, and then we're going to dive into some of the regional aspects of that.
Sure. So starting with inflation, what's interesting to note is I would say many policymakers don't really understand how to explain inflation to their electorates. It's very difficult to do. It's very difficult to explain that when inflation might be coming down, prices are still rising, or the underlying causes of inflation and the sources of inflation. So one could argue that slowing economic growth really caught Trump off guard and cost him the election. One can certainly argue the case for Biden, and we're still at a moment right now where some of Trump's advisors are encouraging him to explain to his electorate why the price of eggs has spiked so much. So we're in this position where price sensitivity is very acutely felt by the American households. We're also in this interesting conundrum where 70% of GDP growth in the United States comes from consumption, but 60% of that growth comes from the top two parts of the income distribution. So really, you only have to look at what happens to those top two parts of the income distribution to see if we're going to have a significant correction in growth. Now, and so in that regard, I would say that was all boats overboard during the GFC. We're not in necessarily a situation like that, but for lower income households and for the bottom 50th percentile of the income distribution, the cost of housing is likely to become It's exorbitant now. It's likely to become ever more elevated with steel and aluminum tariffs, potential curtailments on immigration, transportation as well, potentially with the tariffs on Mexico and Canada propping up things like automobile prices. So the bottom 50th percentile is overstretched, and that's creating social issues. So that's where we are on the inflationary outlook. One thing I would just highlight is a potential boon for the Trump administration is that you could see a softening in liquid fuel prices. So we already are in an oversupplied oil price environment, oil moderately hovering around $71 a barrel. And also the United States, as now the largest LNG exporter in the world, benefits from relatively low Henry Hub prices in comparison to the spot prices in Asia for LNG or in Europe. So there's one kind of boon, which is that you could see softer energy prices. This is something that the president has talked about, as well as Besant. So that could push some pressure down on pricing. But again, if you have things like the cost of housing remaining at record high levels, that's going to put a lot of pressure on disposable income.
One of the things that I think is very relevant for a lot of our listeners on the Cross-Border Tax Talks is U.S. tax reform, and specifically U.S. international tax reform. And there's been a lot of discussion in the news lately with respect to how that gets funded, how that gets accounted for in the Senate and in the House, and this looming fiscal cliff. And there's a question of whether how the tax revenue gets counted for that, tariffs, which generally historically have not been included. How is that impacting businesses? How is that impacting consumers? And I feel like we've been talking about this fiscal cliff in the US for years, and the impact of Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security doesn't really seem like there's a lot of changes. Like, is that day of reckoning coming?
I think if we take a step back and see, how has America been able to continue to write checks that it can't afford? And the reason for that is that the US dollar remains the world's reserve currency. There's nothing as deep and as liquid as US Treasury markets. And that has been tested again and again and again. I actually wrote a piece on this last summer, so happy for you all to share that piece with you. But If we think about the role of the dollar as a reserve currency, it's really fundamentally remained unchallenged by the euro, for example, or by the yen, the sterling, or the RMB. The question becomes, as growth starts to slow in the United States, with this escalation of tariffs, with undoubtedly, I'm very doubtful that you would see dynamic scoring pay for some of the potential extension of the tax reform. So therefore, you see an amplification of the fiscal deficit. Will investors start to vote with their feet? And that's an open question that we're hearing from clients right now, and treasury teams as well. So that's something I think that the Trump administration is really going to have to face. That being said, will it be some kind of massive crash out of the dollar? Unlikely. What I've seen is some central banks start to rotate into holding French or Belgian sovereign bonds as a preference and moving away from the dollar, but not in a really, really dramatic way.
So slight diversification. All right, so let's move on. We've already kind of, I think, maybe moved on to the geopolitical landscape and specifically what you refer to as winners and losers in the trade tensions. And so we're going to go around the world, and maybe we'll start with the U.S., where I think we already started. How do some of these trade tensions, what should large multinational corporations and large, really big, just international businesses be considering, particularly as they think about the U.S.?
Well, firstly, it's important to level set that we entered into Trump 2.0 with a record number of trade restrictions, predominantly in the global landscape. Predominantly, those have been concentrated in goods. If we think about what some of the announcements today and counter tariffs and countermeasures that have been proposed and imposed are all focused on goods. But we're starting to see more and more restrictions on services activity. So, of course, like taxes on digital, companies in Europe would be a great example of that. You're also starting to see more and more potentially escalating taxes on FDI flows. For example, think about the potential for a tit for tat of Japan taxing some of the US FDI inbound into data centers by some of the hyperscalers. Like, that's a reality. So we came into this inauguration with this record number of trade restrictions. What's remarkable, Doug, is that we've not necessarily seen a dramatic slowing of global growth. Mm-hmm. So the IMF has put out these forecasts that you could potentially see as dramatic as a decrease in global GDP of 7% of growth if we have a full-scale fragmentation. We haven't seen that, in part because trade and services has remained relatively robust. If we think about when we were all locked at home during the pandemic and everyone started using AI, well, that was a trade and service. Or legal and business and professional services, which is what PwC is doing for our clients represented in the room. So that is representative in export and service. But coming in now, I think that the real concern is what are the longer term structural impacts of this deeper geoeconomic fragmentation? On the bright side, and talking about the winners, one thing that I would highlight is what I have seen is a trend of greater trade regionalism. So said another way, Asia continues to trade, right? When the United States started announcing all of these protectionist measures, RCEP, which is the largest trade agreement in the world, was enacted in the middle of Asia. We're also seeing Europe continue to be quite robust in terms of trade regionalism. Europe starting to engage more with India, with President von der Leyen's recent trip to go and see Modi. The talks of a potential Middle East, India, Europe economic corridor. So that's one trend, which I think is interesting. And to trickle down to the impact on companies and executives, I had one executive ask me whether he should segregate Asia out of his supply chain. This is pre-Trump 2.0. And I said, absolutely not. You should not segregate the most productive economies out of your supply chain. You're just going to have to divert away potentially from mainland China. And so more and more trade diversion. At a bilateral level, I think also potentially this administration, Trump 2.0, might signal and encourage to other governments that trade transactionalism is something to be emulated. So, said another way, you could potentially go around multilateral bodies and do it yourself. Mm-hmm. That, I think, is going to be a very difficult thing to put back in Pandora's box. At the local level, too, or at the state level, too, this also started prior to Trump, which is the enactment of the IRA magnetized huge flows of FDI into manufacturing activity into the United States.
The
Japan,
Inflation Reduction Act and the
correct.
green energy credits, et cetera.
Correct. Japan and Germany were two of the countries that were representative of some of those large multinationals that have created hundreds of thousands of jobs in the United States. I think other countries will continue to probably use that also as an example, which means it's not necessarily the end of globalization or the end of trade, because companies and countries will continue to engage with one another. We're seeing Japan and Canada actually do that at the moment.
Yeah, and one of the challenges as countries continue to compete for foreign direct investment is how tax policy overlays that. And we've seen, particularly to bring up again, Pillar 2, how certain incentives are considered what I refer to as good incentives and bad incentives for Pillar 2. The market transferable tax credits, which are what the IRA credits, these green energy credits are generally considered good credits for Pillar 2. And I'm very interested to see if, as other countries can adopt similar types of policies, because I've said many times on the podcast, countries are still going to compete for foreign direct investment. And I think the game has changed a little bit with tax policy, and now also with some of the tariff policies that we'll see and how those are being conflated. Just maybe the last piece on the US, and then I want to move to China, is these trade tensions and all of the geopolitical things that are happening with Trump 2.0. What is the potential impact from a GDP perspective? And you know, I'm not sure that the stock market is necessarily the best way to kind of judge that, but I'm interested in, because that's, you know, historically Trump 1.0, he pointed a lot to the stock market. But as we think about the economic environment in the US and particularly GDP growth, how do things like tariffs play a factor?
Let me break that down a little bit. So firstly, with the market piece, of course, there's this age-old adage, which is the stock market is not the economy. The stock market is not the economy. And important to point that out, because the top 10% of the income distribution in America hold $48 trillion worth of equities and mutual fund shares, while the bottom 50th percentile of the income distribution hold 0.48 trillion. So 1/100th. Correct. So
do I have my decimals right?
This is a dramatic, that has dramatic social implications if you're using the stock market as the barometer for the economy, because these gains are not necessarily shared by all or evenly distributed. So first of all, that's important to point out. That also kind of picks up this wealth effect of consumption that I mentioned. As far as the economy goes, the US is a relatively closed economy, fundamentally speaking, traditionally calculated. So really like getting 10 to 12% of our GDP coming from trade. Even if we look at the consumption basket, the total of US consumed goods is really only 11% coming from imported goods. The problem is when you think about pass-on effects like steel and aluminum tariffs increasing, yes, construction, or labor costs increasing construction. The same thing goes for automobiles. Someone like Diane Coyle, who's a wonderful economist, would talk about the quality of life factors that happen from a greater array of choice. And economists have written about this in the US, that the US consumers benefit from being able to import golf clubs from Japan because Japan might have innovated in this space. So you're also impacting a quality of life factor. As for where the US goes, what's interesting to note, something that I've highlighted is I do see a little bit of danger in 100% focusing on manufacturing to support GDP growth in the US, because we don't necessarily have the talent base here anymore. In large part, we started exporting that out in the 1970s. So even despite some of the announcements from some of the large tech companies to invest hundreds of billions of dollars into the US, I have a little bit of concern about the talent curve available to meet that.
All right, so let's move to China. Tell us about the geopolitical landscape there.
Well, I think my opinion has not changed since we met in 2019 here, 6 years ago, that the defining geopolitical trend of our era remains the strategic rivalry between the United States and China. So I don't see that as disappearing. To start with the China macro situation, I would actually argue, when we talk about winners and losers from the trade tensions, I would actually argue that China's not set up necessarily to be a loser here. They understand the playbook of Trump 1.0. They're very well prepared. Some of the largest export partners of China these days happen to be countries like Vietnam, because the China Plus One strategy, Chinese companies have also followed their MNCs outbound and invested into Vietnam. Manufacturing activity in China has just recently hit a 3-year high. Consumption obviously has a long way to go, but can significantly pick up, I would say, over the longer term. China has the most generous household savings rate of any country in the world, standing at 36%.
Wow.
So Chinese consumers, even though there's been this negative net wealth feeling with regard to the property market, can still be relatively resilient. You have other structural forces facing China, such as obviously the demographic problem, declining fertility rates, which other rich Asian countries are needing to deal with.
South Korea, Japan.
Correct. So the way China handles that is going to be interesting. Also, just with regard to taxation, President Xi has been very focused on this common prosperity because the gains in an increasingly services-oriented economy have not necessarily been evenly shared. So he'll have that. So I think you will see changes with regard to taxation going forward. But I do think that China can outstand this escalation of tariffs.
And I read a lot about and you mentioned this, and just wanted to maybe just unpack a little the property market there, the real estate market, and how big of risk does that pose to the Chinese economy? Or is that something out in the future? Obviously, with the declining birth rates, I feel like that's more a problem in the future. But the real estate market is something that appears to be a more eminent risk.
It's a great question. And so Ken Rogoff at Harvard has written a piece where he attributes about as much as a third of Chinese GDP to the property sector. So not insignificant.
Wow.
And when you think about, again, all of the construction activity, et cetera, also just thinking about the net wealth effect, Chinese households have a very, very high home ownership rate. 95% of urban Chinese households own homes. Our PwC partners, because we're so restrained on where we can invest, have pools to invest in property markets. So I would say that that remains a predominant household asset. So the impact of negative net wealth and the feeling of that is one, I think, that carries through the economy. But as we come out of this, I think you were likely to see more and more policy support from the government, and we'll see some actions from some meetings later this week, likely to be able to continue to support the property market. So I don't see it as being the epicenter of making this, the Japanification of China. I don't see that happening.
So let's move then from China, stick with Asia. What about largely Asia? Any certain particular trends in the region or any countries that you're focused on?
Well, so it's interesting because obviously there's this question of whether or not India is the next China. And we know that it's not. We've spoken about this in the past. We know that it's not. But India has been representative of a significant increase in manufacturing activity. And I do see that India can continue to play a role. We're seeing that with some of our clients in the retail space, continuing to build out their distribution centers in India. Now, whether or not Modi 3.0 will be able to pass through, talking about tax again, will be able to pass through some of the important reforms to magnetize FDI and other corporate flows of investment there is a question mark. He had, full majority to be able to do that in 1.0 and 2.0. So any meaningful increases or changes to the taxation, I think, are potentially held in abeyance there. Also, just thinking about other Asian economies, Vietnam, of course, remains a wonderful one to invest in, one of the fastest growing economies in the world. And again, I would call it the Switzerland of Asia, where it sits relatively independently between China and the United States. The extraordinary labor force productivity that we see there is still very much present. Some of the capacity around energy, just like other countries in the world, will need to be addressed with regard to grid constraints. And again, I wouldn't dismiss Japan. Whereas, of course, the BOJ is facing its own conundrum with just this record spread between the yen and the dollar. Japanese corporates are still very well positioned to be able to make plays on Japan outbound Inc. And we've seen those companies magnetize some of the largest investors in the world.
Yeah, on the Vietnam issue, tax policy has been a driver, I think, of some of the manufacturing investment, for example, for some of the tax holidays or incentives, really is the better term in Vietnam. And they were one when this whole Pillar Two came out, and they were one of the first countries that said that they were going to potentially change their tax policies to comply with the Pillar Two rules. And then somebody from the OECD kind of frankly made a shot at Vietnam and really to the larger tax community to say, well, if you are changing your tax policies to circumvent these rules and increase foreign direct investment, that will still be considered a bad incentive. We haven't heard a lot from Vietnam since that, but I think Vietnam, like a number of other countries in Asia that have used some of those incentives to be able to attract foreign direct investment, particularly in the manufacturing sector, I think we're kind of waiting to see how some of the tax policy shakes out with respect to Pillar Two. But I think to your point, countries, particularly U.S. companies, but others are looking to diversify their supply chains out of China. We've seen a tremendous amount of interest in Vietnam and other Asian countries, and I certainly see that as a trend continuing to develop, subject to some of these trade and tariffs issues. So maybe we move from Asia, I think, next to the Middle East. Obviously, a lot going on there geopolitically. So talk about the Middle East.
Well, what's interesting to note is that despite the fact that we've had a hot war within the Middle East, countries like the UAE are some of the fastest growing economies in the world and pegged to grow the fastest for 2025 and 2026. So there is a fact that 2/3 of the world's population lives within a 5-hour flight of Dubai. So really, a country like the UAE is sitting at the linchpin of global growth, be it connecting to East Asia and Southeast Asia, emerging Africa. And so when we think about the potential for growth here, what we're seeing is a lot of consumer companies position themselves either in the UAE or in Saudi to be able to use that as a lily pad for the region. What we're also seeing is a lot of positive incentives from these governments to be able to attract this inbound FDI. And it could be in specific sectors. The UAE is very focused on AI. Saudi is very focused on sports, gaming, hospitality, tourism, and financial services. So that is definitely, I think I would say, a bright spot when it comes to growth. What's also interesting to note, if we round back up to Europe, is that amidst the energy crisis resulting from Russia's invasion of Ukraine, some of these European countries have cemented 30-year contracts in oil and nat gas with countries like Qatar and the UAE and Saudi Arabia. So those energy ties are also being strengthened, which means that European countries are likely and companies are likely to deepen their inroads into the Middle East as well.
So let's move on to, you already teased this, which is Europe. Obviously, a hot war, as you described that, in Europe. One of the other things we're going to talk about from a sector perspective, but you talk about the dormancy of sustainability. There was a recent announcement from the EU with respect to their CSRD, or the Corporate Sustainability and Reporting Directive, sort of easing back some of those regulations that multinationals are going to have to deal with, at least from a sustainability perspective. So what are some other trends that you're seeing in Europe?
I'll start with growth and then we'll come to sustainability. Just looking at the outlook for growth, it's interesting just watching how market participants have been poised over recent days with regard to the US versus Europe. Europe managed to eke out growth in Q4, so we saw data surprise to the upside. Spain being one of the fastest growing economies. There also data from the Netherlands being quite positive. And so now with a current resolution of government or some sort of semblance of certainty in Germany, Merz is now focused on stimulating a potentially 500 billion euro infrastructure package, talking about plays such as the re-defensification of Europe as well. So Europe is looking moderately brighter for some investors.
I think the big challenge with Germany is their debt limitations that they have.
And there's potential reform to this debt break. So also just I would add that what happened with regard to the White House and Zelensky's visit there, I think has only just pushed Keir Starmer closer to Macron. And so now you're actually seeing talk of a potential customs union again between the UK and the EU. So this is all very meaningful and significant, I think, for the EU. I think there's also a question just in terms of the mutualization of debt. We saw that with the Next Generation EU package, which created fiscal union where there was none. And now, at a moment when Europe needs to consolidate, is there a potential for raising more? I would say not a bonanza, like just looking to more government debt sales.
Yeah, there's a lot to be seen what's going to happen with Europe, particularly in Trump 2.0. We saw a number of executive orders that were focused on tax and other trade policy in Europe. And so I think there's still a lot more to see. Obviously, the huge in the news with respect to Zelensky's visit to the White House. And so I think there's going to be a lot more to learn in Europe over the next coming months.
On sustainability.
Yeah, please.
Here's where I would say that in the United States, green is dormant for ideological reasons. And we've seen that happen very clearly. One of the Japanese banks actually just exiting one of the climate alliances today, given its position in the US. We're also seeing this happen for reasons of energy security in Europe, where green is being put to the back burner effectively. But I would argue that it's dormant and not dead. Why? Because we're sitting in California right now, where tragically just north of where we are, the wildfires have ravaged Los Angeles. We are, facing the impacts of climate change when it comes to extreme flooding in Spain. A number of researchers have talked about the impact of heat stress on the property market in Italy, literally limiting transactions because people are too hot to go out and look at properties. So we're in a world where climate change continues to impact our economies to the downside. So I actually would argue that any kind of decisions with regard to the environment are going to take precedence once again. It will just take some time.
All right. So last piece of our Around the World, then we're going to do a rapid fire on sector topics, but Latin America, last but certainly not least.
Well, it's interesting. I would say that in some pockets of Latin America, despite all of the uncertainty that we've been discussing in these hot wars in Europe and the Middle East, that the data has defied the politics, meaning the politics in Latin America swung very, very hard left. But we did see some positive data coming out of countries such as Brazil, even Argentina, which is probably one of the greatest socioeconomic experiments in economic history. You've seen positive data and a populace to support.
That may get usurped, it appears, by the US, but as far as greatest experiments.
No comment. But so therefore, we are continuing to see companies double down on investing in places like Brazil. Now, Lula's opinion ratings have recently plunged to I think now about 14%. You actually have the Selic rate sitting at 12.5%, curtailing investment. So short, choppy times, but I would say that as the largest economy, people are still focused on this. Rounding up to Mexico, I have concern for the trajectory of the Mexican economy with regard to what has just been announced today.
With the tariffs.
Correct.
All right. So want to move into the sector-specific environment and maybe just want to spend a minute or two on each of these. What are things that companies in these industries should be considering? Let's start with the consumer markets.
Sure. Thanks. So I actually think that this Trump 2.0 will continue to distinguish the haves from the have-nots in the retail and consumer space. So said another way, many retailers use Trump 1.0 to create a playbook to play with things like margins and pricing and do exercises like quantum pricing, create value categories to be able to cater toward a spread across the US consumer income brackets. So that I think will only come to the fore. We've seen some of the warnings this morning coming out from some of the retailers here in the US, but I think putting in place those defensive strategies is going to become very important.
All right, the technology sector, which certainly gets a lot of attention.
Tech, I'm worried about. I'll tell you why. Because 59% of the revenue of the tech companies represented on the S&P 500 is earned abroad. So if Europe, and I hinted at this in the beginning, if Europe or Japan gets imposed tariffs, well, then that could be a very clear retaliatory target to tax some of the revenues, for example, or the positions of these US tech companies in their foreign countries. So that I'm slightly concerned about.
And they've certainly, the tech sector, as you mentioned earlier, with digital service taxes from a tax perspective, has certainly been something in the crosshairs of many policymakers. So we'll also continue to see how that evolves, and particularly some of those existing DSTs, given the recent executive order on discriminatory taxes and how that plays, will certainly be interesting. Maybe we move next to the industrial sector.
Yes. So looking to industrial, what was interesting to note, right after the election, crypto was in, industrials were in, all on the back of this potential manufacturing revival in the United States. We are already hearing from some of these manufacturing companies that the imposition of steel and aluminum tariffs, of course, may hinder profits, and U.S.-owned businesses. So that's, I think, very clear. I would also just highlight again this potential lack of talent to be able to support the high-end, high-tech manufacturing space in the US. It's great dreams, but again, I don't necessarily think we have the talent here. To extend out of industrials just into the energy sector as well, that was another sector that was held up by the electoral results. One thing to note is that the United States already is the largest producer of oil in the world, now a net oil exporter, and the largest exporter of LNG. So there's probably not a lot of room on energy policy where we can go to pump more, drill, baby, drill. But what I would say is the power-hungry generation demand from Gen AI will continue to drive power generation needs across the board. So if I was an energy company, I would be focused on going into any country and be focused on wooing some of these potential tax cuts, because I think more and more countries are going to be focused on energy security and feeding into this energy avaricious data centers.
All right. And how about financial services?
Well, that's one sector that I think everyone is poised to potentially benefit from the wave of deregulation in the United States. I would also highlight that the U.S. banks on price to book ratio have been performing very, very well relative to their other peers. So U.S. banks have been in a pretty strong position. I think what we also have to watch out for is putting the crypto and digital asset aside, whether or not we actually have a digital dollar and reform in that space in the U.S. is a question mark.
So maybe we'll end with Alexis. I mean, we're in front of a tax audience here. Most of the listeners of the Cross Border Tax Talks podcast, I hope, are tax people. If not, maybe they're using it to fall asleep. I'm not sure. What advice do you have for those of us that play in the tax space? Obviously, we spend a tremendous amount of time keeping up with all the change and rules and laws and policies around the globe. But geopolitics and macroeconomics play such a big role, and you spend a lot of time talking to C-suite executives. What advice do you have for tax professionals, maybe that you've learned through the conversations that you have with CEOs, CFOs, COOs as they're thinking about major decisions for their enterprises?
I mean, I would think a clear defensive strategy would be to look at where there are areas where your decisions are actually creating jobs and creating sustainable economic growth, right? I mean, that's a very clear one. I mentioned this job creation of Japanese and German inbound companies in the US, and like that data does not see the light of day. So you have to be careful about where you're creating the jobs. But I think the ability to be able to communicate that to stakeholders is going to become increasingly important, especially as we're in this very heightened, very emotional tit for tat environment with regard to trade and potential, using tax as a potential reprisal.
Yeah, and this is a common theme on the podcast, where we encourage, particularly in the U.S. but elsewhere, is to engage in engage with policymakers in policy making. And one of the big looming changes for any multinational that operates in the U.S. is the expiration of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. And so we know it's very likely that there's going to be some form of tax reform. And so being able to engage with policymakers as well as the C-suite to understand what those downstream implications are for investment, for jobs, whether it's in the U.S., particularly as you're trying to inform policy, is something that we very much advocate for companies and stakeholders to be able to educate those policymakers to help them drive those policy decisions. So, Alexis, always a pleasure having you on. Always love sort of going around the world and listening to your expertise. So thanks again for coming on.
Thanks for having me, Doug.
So thanks for tuning in to this week's episode of Cross-Border Tax Talks. Thank you, Dr. Alexis Crow, PwC's Chief Economist. I'm Doug McHoney, PwC's International Tax Services Global Leader. Stay tuned for another exciting edition of the Cross-Border Tax Talks podcast.
This podcast is brought to you by PwC, all rights reserved. PwC refers to the U.S. member firm or one of its subsidiaries or affiliates and may sometimes refer to the PwC network. Each member firm is a separate legal entity. Please see www.pwc.com/structure for further details. This podcast is for general information purposes only and should not be used as a substitute for consultation with professional advisors.